One balmy evening, Mullah Nasruddin was out taking an evening stroll when he saw a drunken man lying in a ditch. So he went down to investigate, and when he rolled the unconscious being over, he saw that it was the local judge who was renowned for his harsh moral judgments. So Mullah Nasruddin took off the fancy slippers of the judge and removed his ornate cloak. Well, the next morning, when the judge awoke from his drunken stupor, he realized he'd been robbed, and he went staggering off down the road and called the police, "Find those slippers and that cloak." So, of course, they found the slippers and the cloak in Mullah Nasruddin's house, and Mullah Nasruddin was hauled up before the judge. And the judge said, "Well, what have you got to say for yourself?" Mullah Nasruddin said, "Well, I was taking an evening stroll and I saw this drunk in the ditch. And so I borrowed his slippers and his cloak. But when I tried to find out who it was, I haven't been able to find him. Would you happen to know who it is?" And the judge said, "Certainly not. Case dismissed." Then there's a version of a Sufi allegory that's in the line with what's been spoken of these last days. It's the story of a maiden called Fahima, and Fahima has a special meaning. But Fahima became an orphan, but she was left a very rich legacy. But Fahima was renowned not only for her beauty, but also her ability to read people's hearts, her insights, and her caring and empathy with all. But she very wisely kept to herself, because there were many suitors who sought her hand in marriage, a lot of them for her money, but many also because she was beautiful, intelligent, and so forth. But also she was sought after by women also who wanted to know where she got her abilities from. But one day, when Fahima was standing on her balcony, a prince came by and, looking up, saw her and instantly fell in love with her. And from that day on, every day he came by, he wrote her poetry, he sang her songs, he paraded up and down showing his muscles and his stature and so forth and so on. But in between times he went off and practiced and went hunting and all of those things that princes do as well. But you know, Fahima knew what he was up to. She understood him better than he understood himself. So one day she allowed herself to be available when the prince and his entourage were coming by. So she also allowed herself to be snatched up and taken by the prince back to his palace, where he immediately placed her in a dungeon down in the depths of his palace. But every day he would go down and he said, "You know that I want to marry you, and I know that you won't take me until I prove myself to you." And she understood exactly what was going on. And this went on day after day, week after week, month after month, until the prince got a little tired of his beseeching, so he decided to go off to a far distant land to have some diversion from this serious But Fahima herself had not been languishing in her dungeon. She'd been busy making a tunnel which she could make her way out back into the world. But the prince rode off, and as these things go, Fahima, it came to her ears from the gossips of those jailers who took care of her that the prince was going off to a certain place. So Fahima went out of her tunnel, and taking a very fast carriage, she went to the place where the prince was going to be. Now the prince really indulged in the many diversions that there were available to him in this place, the entertainment and the receptions and all of those things. But one day he happened to be passing a mansion on his way to a certain reception, and looked up and saw a beautiful maiden. He said, "Oh, this looks just like my Fahima." And he fell in love. He immediately went to her and said, "I want to marry you." And the maiden, who of course was Fahima, said yes. So they were married. And after some time, Fahima had a child, a daughter. But after some while, the prince had this roaming urge in him again to move on, dissatisfaction, not feeling. So he left his wife and child and set off for another far distant place. Well, of course, Fahima, with her abilities, was able to find out where he was going. And she very quickly made her way to this new place also. And as you can probably glean, the same thing happened. She set herself up. The prince came by, fell in love with her, married her. And she had another child, a boy this time. But again, the prince, with his wayward ways and this restless spirit inside of him, set off again, leaving this wife and child behind him. And again coming to another place where there were more diversions and things to do. But Fahima set herself up in a strategic position, and the same thing happened. He fell in love, looking just like my beautiful Fahima, married, had another child. But then the prince got bored. He got homesick. He wanted to go home. And so he decided, and he left this wife and child and returned to his palace. But there was a great change taking place in him. Deep, deep in his soul, he felt a great remorse. And he went down to the dungeon and looked in, and he said, "Fahima, Fahima, Fahima, I know I have always wanted to marry you. I have always loved you, but I have been errant. I have erred. I have done so many things that are considered sins and wrong. I dare not even ask you for your hand in marriage again." But Fahima said, of course she was back in her dungeon again. She said, "Please, if you will tell me the truth, everything that has happened, leaving nothing out, perhaps I will be able to help you, and even consider being wedded to you." "Oh no," said the prince, "there have been so many, many errant deeds." But she said, perhaps, if you tell me all, there can be a way. So with these words, the prince related every detail, the marriages, the women that he'd left behind. And then Fahima said, there is a way. Go to your drawing room, and when there is a knock on the door and someone is announced, open the door. And so the prince went off, and Fahima dressed herself up in all of her finery, and with her 3 children she went to the door of the drawing room. When she knocked, the door was opened, and the prince could not believe his eyes. And suddenly the realization came to him that each of the women he had married had been Fahima. The children who he thought was to different women were the children of this one woman. With tears flowing down his eyes, he begged Fahima, marry me, marry me. And so she did.
Fourth time. Fourth marriage.
So if we look at this story, again, as we know, all characters are part of us. So what does Fahima mean? Although he went off with what appeared to be 3 other women, we can recognize that Fahima has great significance. What is its meaning for us? In the light of what's been looked at over these last days, recognizing that there has to be a unifier for those 3 levels of life: nitty-gritty, spirit, the occult, and undifferentiated interrelatedness. What is it that brings them all together in us, and that is clearly recognized as is represented by Fahima? What would Fahima mean? What name would you give it? Most of us point to our heart and say, here it is. But is it here? Is it in our heart that unity takes place? What is this Fahima? Thank you.